Cool. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to a familiar face, to some. Chris Phillips, who's going to talk about mobile phones, miracle or menace. Cheers,
Thanks,
Chris.
Simon. Thank you. Yes, it's been a little bit of a break since I was last here. I've got a little demo to start with. I'm starting off on my dark slide to start with. The idea was going to come with a headset on, but instead I found this in the car. So what I was going to do was, there you are, you've got a flashing light, guys. Right. This is my first demo. Okay, right. And the idea of that is to talk about the difference between a carrier wave, which is the light, which is a very high frequency, and the pulses, which are extremely low frequency. So that's my talk is going to be based on that sort of subject, so we'll get into it shortly. So mobile phones have been around a while, and an ancient man had the old telling bone. He really did very well in the early days, but we've come along a long way since then. And I've actually got a little Apple iPad, iPhone here, which I'm going to send around for somebody to look inside. If you want to have a look inside an iPhone, if you've not already looked inside one, then there's one in pieces, so I'll pass that around. Okay, the technology is quite amazing, what they've built into these things. I haven't got one yet, but I'm most impressed with the technology. Yes, the background I'm going to go through, first of all, a little bit of background, partly my own background, and then talk about the technology. So I'm going to get a little bit techie there. And then we talk about the biological effects, which I think we should consider. And then a little bit about health and safety, and some conclusions from that. Okay, so going back to, anybody remember the bricks from, was it the 80s? Oh, right, okay. Yes, I never actually had one or saw one close up, but obviously, once upon a time, we were starting off in this whole realm of mobile phones. But the whole big problem was that the spectrum, the radio spectrum, was so crowded, and each little bit is being filled up so fast that humanity has had to find ways of overcoming these limitations. It's a modern miracle what we've actually achieved with such limited resources. However, it's become a way of life. So most of us wouldn't manage without a mobile phone. And you see them even being given out to the youngsters of today. They're actually finding themselves issued with a mobile phone from a very early age, which I'm not very happy about. But anyway, let's go into how it works, or how I understand it works. And if anybody's got anything to add who's got experience, I'll be very grateful if they want to chip in later on. Okay. But I've done a little bit of research, so hopefully, if you want to read afterwards, there's some paperwork I've developed on the subject. My experience was working in the Air Force, maintaining radio equipment for air traffic control. So people who want to talk to aircraft using analog in those days had to use RT procedure, because you could only have one person on the frequency at a time. So the air traffic controller would talk to somebody using a call sign, the pilot would reply, and so on. And then you pass on to a new guy when you get a new frequency. So simplex was the way it had to be. Yeah. But we were using quite powerful transmitters to reach maybe hundreds of miles using UHF, VHF. And so the procedure was something you had to live by, because you couldn't have more than one person talking at one time. And the properties you're probably aware of, line of sight, it can be quite directional, not affected too much by the weather. And if you're at all technical, you realize that the aerials can be quite small once you get into the very high frequencies, smaller wavelength. So, talking about the radio spectrum and the limitations that we've got. Okay. Really, the problem is we haven't got enough space for all the people who want to talk. It looks like, anyway, if you give them one frequency each. So it's maybe a way of getting over this was to not have powerful transmitters, but have very weak transmitters, so that the range will be limited. And so you have a lot of little transmitters talking to nearby receivers, and that way we could have a lot of people talking at the same time, using very high frequencies. So the Americans, I think, came out with these cells originally, and I've got a little diagram showing in the city, it may be 500 meters wide, the cell, but out in the country, it could be kilometers. So a cell is a local area which will have a set of frequencies allocated to it, and it could be in the 900, 1800 megahertz range, up into the gigahertz. And we place transceivers around inside each of those cell areas. So I've plonked in a couple of transmitters there, and each time you've got a group around each transmitting station. Now, I've used the initials BTS. Some people say BS, but I think the Americans don't like you saying BS, so I'm saying BTS for the base station. And as you can see, each base station has a group of cells around it, which it then is in charge of. The handset, the mobile, I've given it out now, the mobile finds its nearest station, makes contact with it, and then once it's connected to one station, then they're controlled by the BTS. So then they're down the chain, eventually connected to the network through the radio system. Okay, nobody got any questions so far? Right. Now, GSM is the basis of most of the mobile systems that I know of, apart from Tetra, which we'll get on to. And initially, you probably heard the sound of it when your phone starts making contact with the station. There's an initial handshaking which takes place. Now, this diagram here, somebody actually did using a tiny detector, and produced that very good image to show you the high initial pulses as you're making contact with the transmitter. And then later on, you can see it drops down. Once speech is actually taking place, the power level really drops down. So initially, the handshaking is at very high power so that you actually make contact with your nearest station. Okay. It happens that they use different frequencies between the uplink and the downlink. We're going to be competing with the footballers. And the good old BTS actually monitors the strength of the signal by you sending back a little test package every so often. So in that way, it maintains the strength of your signal while you're talking. The way we do things is to split the package up, or split time up into lumps. And so your messages, your voice, is turned into very small slots or packages of sound, which are then digitized. And time division multiplexing is the clever trick they use to send lots of information out in the same area. There's also things like frequency hopping, which I'm not sure about, but things don't stay on the wrong frequency all the time. They are constantly moving. So this is the big thing that I want to get onto. The actual way that the data is contained within this transmission is using frames. And if you look at the longest period hyperframe, it's 3.5 hours. Okay, but below that, we're talking about 6 to 12 seconds for what we call a superframe. And packaged within that, then, we've got multiframes, either 51 or 26 multiframes. You'll see the difference. In the traffic signal, which is our voice, then there'll be 51 multiframes. The control signal will take over 26. Okay, so each of these frames could be in the region of 4 to 6 milliseconds, which is not a long time, but it's quite a little chunk. If you have 8 time slots within that frame, then it works out that this thing is repeating that little pulse of information about 217 hertz, 217 times a second, which is what you would think in most terms a very, very slow frequency, isn't it? It's almost audible. In fact, it is audible, isn't it? 200 hertz is easily audible. So that is an extremely low frequency that as the information is pulsed out from on that massive gigahertz signal. Okay. So I just went a little bit further. There is another pulse. Within that period, there's a 26-second pulse signal, which is running at 8.3 hertz. Okay, that's the traffic multiframe. Okay, so there is a break in the frames. You can see it down the bottom line there. There's a break. They miss a pulse out. And if that repeats at the frequency of 8 times a second, which is very, very low frequency pulse. Okay, so all this package is what has actually been transmitted to your mobile phone and back to the tower. How do we put our voice in there? Well, our voice is divided into little 20 millisecond blocks, and each of those is coded into 456 bits. I have to read the numbers. Okay, so 8 blocks, 57 bits, and each of those blocks then is one of those little pink blits there. Okay, so that's 57 bits of data from your voice sandwiched in there. Then there's a little break, and your voice is actually another 57 bits are sent later on from another part of your voice. And in between, there's 27 bits of signal just to allow the transmitter station to find out how much level you are. So that's a standard test signal there. So that's the package of your voice going down in tiny, tiny little chunks at this very, very slow frequency. Okay, so that's GSM. Other systems that use very similar technology are DECT, which is the cordless phone basis. Their frequencies up in the gigahertz, 1.9 gigahertz. And they use various modulation frequencies and systems. So I've just done quick research on them, range about 100 meters. And you can see there, 10 milliseconds is the frame length. So what does that work out at? That's about 100 hertz, isn't it? 100 times a second. So those are pulsing out continuously all day long. You've got your mobile base station at home. It's transmitting 100 hertz through your whole house all day long at gigahertz. Okay, so that's the system you'd use in your home for your cordless phone. The guys on the emergency services, the Tetra system, it's used throughout Europe by emergency services and so on. That uses a slightly lower frequency range, 300 megahertz, and it's quite a limited number of users per channel, but it's a very robust system. It's designed to be resilient and able to work in emergency conditions, very high security, but it's transmitting constantly all the time. So whether you're on a vehicle or in a transmitter station, it's transmitting all the time. I tried to look at these signals consistence, and it works out that the pulse rate is around about 17 hertz. So another low frequency, and that's what's sitting on these guys' chest all day long. They're being pulsed by this 17 hertz, and the burst every 70 times a second. Okay, so all these things have got a very low repetition rate. I'm yet to believe that there's a new system going to replace it eventually, but Tetra currently is the system that the police use. It's very handy for them because they can actually talk mobile to mobile. So that's the big advantage of Tetra. If you have an emergency, somebody can become a base station, and the guys can use them as the center point instead of having to rely on a mast somewhere. Wi-Fi, if you can just make it out. Everybody's got Wi-Fi. The whole place is surrounded by Wi-Fi. This is up in probably the 2.4 to 5 gigahertz. So that's a very high frequency range. Frame rates are about 5 to 10 milliseconds. It's quite variable depending on how much data and that sort of thing. But again, a low frequency. And you can see the packaging is quite complicated, how they fit all the data in. But again, modulation rate 2 to 250 hertz. And if you increase your data rates, then the modulating frequencies will actually go up. Okay, I've got some examples there. Okay, so data rates, each time you double the bandwidth, you double the power. Okay, did anyone hear about beamforming? In other words, the more sophisticated transmitters can actually focus on the person who's actually using them. So they can, with the antennas, they can actually focus on different people in the area, so that you get a better response. So you're being targeted when you tune into the local base station. Okay. I'm really concerned, having read about this stuff, that youngsters are now growing up in school using laptops which are being fed by Wi-Fi, because the government is encouraging schools and areas to fit Wi-Fi, mainly because it saves on wiring. And that's one of the things it's saving on having separate wires for each mobile device. So these poor lasses are sitting there using these Wi-Fi machines. They've been irradiated by these frequencies, Panorama did a program on it. I don't know if you ever saw it back in 2011, which studied the signal using spectrum analyzers, and it was actually far more powerful than the signal from the mobile station that was nearby. It was actually the radiation from their own machines that was actually the highest. And you can see right down the bottom there's a big pulse for the low frequency modulation. Yes, a lot of countries in Europe have actually got quite serious about this. Some of them actually banned. Austria, they've banned the use in schools. Sweden, I think, if somebody's hypersensitive, and there are maybe 2% of the population are, and they can actually sense these waves, then the school has to stop using the signals for the basis of for those kids. Main concern for the doctors I've read about is that youngsters, especially girls, are developing within them the possible children they're going to have, which could be affected by these signals, and it could produce birth defects several generations down the way. So that's one of the worries that medical people have on the subject. We, unfortunately, have one of the highest signal rates in Europe. I don't know if you can see that. We're following strictly to the guidelines, and we've got enormous power levels everywhere you go. A lot of countries have brought their power levels really, really low, but we're still blasting out 1,000 microwatts per square centimeter there. Looks good. Okay, so are we leading ourselves into trouble? Another system, obviously, people use Bluetooth mics and so on. Very little information about these, but I've put on the frequency range. Time slot's about 600 microseconds. So the repetition frequency is about 300 hertz. And it hops frequencies as well. But again, there's a high power one, which has got 100 meter range. And then there's a lower power, which is the normal one, which is about 10 meters. There's no safety systems covering this, no SAR reporting. That's the specific absorption rate, because they base that on the heating effect. And these little tiny things can't produce enough heat, but they are still producing this low frequency radiation, which could be damaging your heads. Okay. So, wireless technology then, in general, it uses a pulsed radio frequency transmission, extremely bioactive frequencies that it's actually producing, and it's used everywhere we go now. My office at work, completely filled with Wi-Fi, 50 Hive transmitters around the site. So wherever I go, I can use my laptop. I'm not really happy about it, but they say, oh, it's in guidelines, it'll be safe, you'll be all right. So we've covered mobiles, we've covered cordless, Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, and the latest thing I've got is smart meters. That's the next thing that's coming along, which uses the same technology, and you haven't got any choice. Once it's in your house, it's radiating around your entire building. So be aware whether you have the option or not. They've started introducing smart metering, I think, in places like Australia, and they had a lot of problems there. Little information that I can find on this at all. It's very closed shop. People like IBM keep it very in-house. But they did find a lot of psychological effects when they produced it in Australia. A lot of people finding their sleep was being disturbed just by having these things switched on outside their bedrooms. Anxiety, heart palpitations, lots of effects which could be reproduced in the lab, and completely they do follow whether the thing is switched on or not. They are double-blanked tests on that. IBM are the big ones. I don't know who else is actually into it, but they want us to be all included in this big, happy, smart meter family. Okay. So we've talked about pulsed microwave or very high frequency radiation, and excuse me, it's becoming part of our lives. We can't escape it from most places where we walk. But is it as harmless as we're told it is? Okay. What are the safety issues? Well, most of us think it's heating effect, isn't it? If it doesn't heat you up, then it's safe. Okay, that's what we're told. And the government policy is to use the guidelines, which are called the ICNIRP guidelines. And I've gone into them a bit. I've printed out a copy there if you want to have a look. And the safety guidelines go back to 1998. So is compliance with these guidelines actually going to guarantee your safety? That's what I'd like you to think about. I can't read it from here, so I'm going to have to look up here, sorry. Yes, so they're talking about limiting EMF exposure. And will that provide protection against known adverse health effects? Now, of course, they've said known adverse health effects. So if it's a bit doubtful, it's not known, is it? So if it's possible, it's not known, is it? And more bits. So what adverse health effects? Well, it very strictly says there in black and white, it's only the absence of short-term immediate health effects. That's the only thing they're guaranteeing with all these safety levels. Short-term health effects. Not long-term, not anything that's going to affect you in several years' time. Only short-term. So if you're a worker fitting up masts, you know you're safe. You can be exposed so much. These are pulse microwave fields, and they actually admit that there are definitely more effective biological responses from pulsed rather than continuous radiation fields. They know that, but it's still dodgy science, so they won't commit themselves. And they've also found that the levels are really, really variable. So there can be extremely small levels, and as they say, windows. So windows of response makes it extremely difficult to make acceptable models. Yeah. So the scientists hate it because you can't say that's a fixed level, it's variable. Where you walk around in this room, different levels go up as you move around. So it's extremely difficult subject to narrow down. So these non-thermal influences that I'm talking about are right down in the extra low frequency or super extra low frequency range. And in the words of Mr. As I'll talk about Dr. Carlo, it's information carrying signals. That's what is the danger that I think we're going to be worrying about. Okay, so microwave oven, perfectly safe. It's just producing a nice, steady, continuous wave most of the time. So that's a heating effect. We don't have to worry about that because the body doesn't respond to high power, it responds to low power. It makes me worry that the kids are carrying these things around and walking around with them next to their heads because their skulls are obviously much thinner, much easily affected by the signals. Going back several years, going back 40-odd years, the military has been playing with this stuff because they've started off with radar, and then obviously from that on, they've developed into other more useful things such as biological problems. So pulse microwaves have been found to cause biological effects. They know that, and they've used it. They designed these sort of machines to actually use for crowd control. They can actually make people respond to using these invisible rays. And they've been testing on animals and humans, so they know how to control us using this sort of frequency range. It could be used for crowd control and so on. This chap here, I don't know if you go onto the web, you'll see Mr. Barry Trower. He's very concerned. He's actually worked with the governments. He got really involved in the military and so on, and he's very concerned particularly for young people, and even the emergency service. He's worried about these girls walking around with these things stuck on their chests all day long. So he's one of the players. There's quite a few players in this. The chap who started me off is Dr. George Carlo. There is a little video that might play if I'm lucky. And he was talking originally when I saw him in Dublin. He talked to some doctors in a conference. He was actually commissioned by the cell phone industry to investigate the safety aspects of mobile phones. And he was given $1 million or what it was to do some studies back in the 90s, epidemiologist. And he found trouble. He did find things wrong. So did they keep him on? Did they pay him more and more to find out more? No, they kicked him out, and they tried to discredit him. So he found out all sorts of things about the way cells behave, down at the biocell signaling level. Okay, the DNA being disrupted, the cells starting to dysfunction, eventually the cells dying just by this frequency stuff. And he constantly says it's information carrying radio waves that are the killers. Well, certainly if you're a cell. So what happens in biology? Our cells are a well-tuned system. The whole body is a well-tuned resonance system. And so each cell has its membrane and a barrier surrounding it to protect it. The barrier's impermeable, but obviously you can get chemicals through. The nutrients are controlled. My image here is showing you these protein pumps going through the cell. And what's quite interesting is that the way the cell behaves is like a liquid crystal. But that's a side issue, and we're not going to that. But inside the cell, then, are these little pumps, which are called ATP motors. But it's quite fantastic if you look these up on the web and see these little tiny pumps pumping away. And these are on a microscopic nanometer scale. And these control the movements of nutrients through into the cell. But everything in the body is designed to look out for danger, and there is an automatic process in place to protect the cells. And if they imagine there's an invasion taking place, which is what these low frequencies look like, then they will start to shut down to protect themselves. They see the enemy as being something that's dodging along at low frequency. They don't worry about gigahertz, that doesn't affect them. But something that's dodging around at low frequencies, that could be the enemy. So that's when they start behaving as though they're going to shut down. And there's the picture of the ATP motor. Various sensors in the cell membrane, which are chemical responding or vibrational. As far as I know, it's the vibrational ones that are responding to these frequencies. They can recognize the extra low frequencies. Okay. Apparently, it only takes a few milliseconds for the resonance to actually lock, and the cell will actually start to respond. So it doesn't take long for the cells to respond, and within 5 seconds, they can actually shut down completely and stop any nutrients flowing. Okay, another chap who's done some research is Mr. Goldsworthy, or Dr. Goldsworthy at UCL, and he's come up with a slightly different explanation. It looks like it's the same thing he's talking about, but he calls it the chemical calcium potassium movement. So it's the positive cell ions and so on. I was never very good at chemistry, but I can now see that electricity and chemistry are very tightly connected. And so positive and negative charges. It's the electric universe again, sorry guys, but it's happening inside our very cells. And at a very low frequency, like 16 hertz, he could see effects going on. So he's reproducing a type of response. And the cells become permeable and so on. DNA, so he's even worrying about Wi-Fi causing the neurons to misfire and so on. And he's pointing to things like ADHD in children, possibly being triggered by these sort of events, frequencies. Okay. So there are amplitude windows, as I said. So amplitude is actually quite critical as to whether something affects you or not. Okay, and then there's more and more people I can quote you from. Mr. Hyland, he's from Germany, I think. He's done more work, and he's talking about unlike the heating effect, which we know the microwaves are responsible for, the non-thermal effects have a much more subtle way via their potentiality to interfere with the biological functionality. And it's that bioprocesses which are intended to afford protection. In other words, these protection systems are actually acting against us because they are causing the health effects. So if we didn't have our protection systems, we may not be suffering. But that's nature actually looking after us. Okay. After this, I'm not quite sure how long I've got left. I've just basically put together various articles which I'm not going to even try and go through, but just to show you that there is a lot of information out there. And if you look at the video afterwards, you'll be able to pick up some of the references I put in there. There's somebody saying about the major health worries about the deployment of smart grid. So again, that's America worrying about it because they've already got a lot of smart grid in place. So safety studies, it's mostly people thinking that heating effect is the problem, but heating effect is a blind. It's not the actual cause of the problem. Electromagnetic radiation from wireless technologies is especially harmful when pulsed. So bear in mind, that's what you're carrying next to you, is the pulsed microwave radiation. I'm not going to try and read all this, otherwise we're going to run out of time. I built these slides up ages ago. There's another lady there who's actually come up with a huge list of effects which she's aware of. And some people are obviously more sensitive than others, but some people can actually pick up these effects from not only mobile phones, but all this from masts and so on. Even low frequencies from the mains, some people are affected by. Okay, just running through a few slides here. As I said, Mr. Trower is very worried about children and the effects that children have been subjected to. They're weaker immune systems. They have smaller heads, the bone's thinner, and so particularly females with their developing ovaries, they can be affected, particularly if they're walking around with their laptops on their knees and so on. So it doesn't bode well, I'm afraid. There's even been articles in the press on the subject, Telegraph there. So we should be thinking about, particularly if we've connected with young people, trying to keep them separated from these machines as much as possible so they don't injure themselves for the future. This is actually lifted from an Australian recommendation. A slight play on words there, health and safety. How do you reduce your exposure? So thinking about it in your daily life, if you can avoid using your phone close to you right on a regular basis, particularly if you're inside a vehicle, avoid that because obviously the power level goes up because the signal has to go through the metalwork. Try using text, obviously. Most people are using text more now anyway. And avoid using it in a poor signal area because obviously your mobile will increase its power level to reach the transmitter. And think where you're walking around with your mobile phone here or wherever, what's it actually doing to you over a long period? Okay. I'm sorry it's been a little bit less amusing than my previous talk, but I feel quite concerned about this subject. A lot of people seem to be quite unaware that it could be a danger. And so if anybody's got any questions, I might be able to answer a few.
To protect yourself, could you carry your phone in a metal foil bag or something like that?
Well, I think that there are people selling various protective devices, but I don't know what protection they offer you. Because you have to obviously keep the thing on most of the time if you're using a mobile phone. Yeah.
So it looks like the tinfoil hat people are correct.
I'm sorry?
It looks like the tinfoil hat people are correct.
Yes, we are actually going to. Yes, if you discover that you're actually very sensitive, and some people are very sensitive, then they even have to line their houses with mesh and so on to keep themselves shielded, because some people are terribly, maybe only 2% of the population, but people really are reacting to these things. Yes, I haven't come up with any plans how to protect yourself from the mobile yet.
Thanks.
Anyone else have a question?
I was just going to say, one of the things is that it's about learning.
Yeah.
So, like whales will talk to each other through the oceans. So if we go into an ocean, we'll be listening to all these whales, but we won't know about it, will we?
Right.
So, but if we tuned into those whales, we'd be able to listen to their conversations.
Yeah.
So, given all these waves are around all the time, then we
Do you
can
think
tune
we'd adapt
into
to
them
it?
or tune out of them.
Yeah.
So it's about learning to manage them as opposed to necessarily having to avoid them.
Yes. Well, it depends if our bodies can survive. We don't know, do we? Because we've only really been in this environment for maybe 20 or 30 years. We don't know in the long term. Some people are suffering from tumours, and I saw a photograph of a woman who used to keep their mobile phone in her, probably in her bra, but there was an actual outline of the shape of the tumour was the shape of the phone. So she'd actually got that tumour from carrying the phone around too much. No, I don't think so. But obviously, everything be photoshopped now, so yes, you're right.
How many people have died from mobile phones?
This is the big problem, is actually how to get the figures for it.
Well, we do have the Turing shroud as well.
Right,
And,
yeah.
and how many people have been helped with technology? And
Oh, I
mobile
know,
phones?
I agree. That's what I said at the beginning. It's a miracle, and it could be a menace.
And your theory is to take technology away from kids?
I'd say limit the technology you give to kids. Don't necessarily give them the technology too soon when they don't actually need it.
That's rubbish.
And teach them to be safety conscious.
I've got a quick question. A lot of the slides you showed for the evidence,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people here would have to remain skeptical.
Yeah,
because
right.
it's in our nature.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of the slides were for older research projects.
Oh, sure.
Certainly, I think the most recent one was about 10 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the other links you put up were what, as a skeptic, I would say were more esoteric links. Kind of American style.
Uh-huh.
Almost, and I dare say it, tinfoil hat brigade.
Yeah.
So I think before the talk, what my point is what I would like to see as a skeptic is more up-to-date scientific evidence.
Yeah, and who's going to fund that? Who's going to fund that research then?
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be anything presented today which is recent scientific evidence.
Sure.
Thank
Do you think anybody's got the incentive to actually do it?
Yes.
Because most times that anybody's been sponsored by the... if somebody's actually... Yes. Well, what figures are we actually being able to discover on this? That's the big problem.
You showed a slide there with a military
Yeah.
application. I can't remember the acronym for the device.
Yeah.
If the military now have built a device to effect crowd control,
Yeah.
then surely they're clearly aware of the harmful effects and are exploiting it for that purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
But doesn't stop them using the mobile phones themselves, does it?
yes, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
But yeah, no, they know already that this is a harmful. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I've always been taught to keep away from radar because obviously that was the earliest form of pulsed RF that we had, and we were always told it was dangerous. But then that was mainly because of the high power levels, which would actually burn you. But I think being responsible and actually warning you that there is a possible danger, whether it's actually showing up in multiple tumours, I don't know. I started researching this years ago, and when I heard this Dr. Carlo. I'm sorry? Yes, well, maybe for some sort of health risk, but this is an invisible health risk, and you don't know if you're susceptible until it's too late. So I would say, warn on the side of caution, avoid using the mobile phone in enclosed places and in low signal areas and in your vehicle. And then wireless, limit your access to wireless. But I'm surrounded by it now. I've got to work with the damn stuff every day of my working career now. Suffering terribly. It's mainly because I have to wake up at 5 in the morning every day. That's why I'm suffering. I haven't noticed the effects yet. But some people actually do detect the effects. Some people have got this sensitivity, but as I say, it's only about 2% of us actually can detect it. Any more questions? Sorry, but I've overrun my 20 minutes, I think. Okay, thank you very much.